Up until this point, we've really talked about the concept of community using the lens of actor network theory. So we talked about the value of the relationships, that's the network, and of the actants, which included the people and the big ideas and other forms of technology. We've also talked about the process of translation, which started with defining the problem, then having people see it as their problem and become engaged and interested in it, having people accept roles and have them accepting ways of fitting into the network, and then becoming mobilized and active. But there's a whole area of that we need to explore further, and that is the community within your team. If your team, as a group of translators or community developers, isn't healthy as a community, then the work that it does will also end up being either ineffective or, even worse, causing harm. So we want to really stop and take a look at our community of practice. This is an idea put together by a couple of theorists called Lave and Wenger. And they usually refer to communities of practice by thinking about workplaces. But it doesn't really matter, because what they've come to understand is that almost every organization really functions as a community of practice, and that includes communities of all sizes. Even your family has a community of practice. And we can say that the product of all of the ingredients of the community of practice are best defined as culture. And what I tell the organizations I work with is it really doesn't matter whether you have the best policy manual, the best HR person, whether you pay the most money on the block, whether you have excellent disciplinary processes or benefits. None of those things will make a difference if your organizational culture isn't good. And that's true within your working group as well. So in order for us to think about effective teams, we have to think about the ingredients within those communities. We have to think about our domain. What do we agree that we are interested in? What is our common ground, our shared interest? And what do we agree are the focal points of our work, the big issues that we want to tackle? How are we going to function as a community? For example, what will we talk about? What activities will we do? And what do we need to go out and learn more about? How will we do that? For example, I've sat around many boardroom tables where people have debated for sometimes hours about something, and what they didn't hear themselves saying is, none of us really knows enough about this to make a decision. And what they should have done is agreed to go and ask somebody who did know. But that takes a long time if a community doesn't actually stop and think about what it needs to learn. It's also important for the team or the community to think about the way it does things, the practices. For example, does it keep knowledge? Does it have, for example, records of things that happen? Does it preserve some of its learning on video from, for example, experienced people or in policy manuals? Does it try to have methods that are replicable? For example, I've gone and worked with organizations where a person is retired and I've been asked to take on their job. And I'm always mystified when I say, how did this person put together this event? And nobody knows. They didn't get them to write it down. We need to make sure that we do that. What stories have been compelling? For example, many organizations take a great deal of pride in their history, and so they tend to write it down or capture it in some other form. And what tools have you developed? One of my friends works for a company that sells food to convenience stores. But along the way, they became extremely good at managing their inventory because what they were selling was perishable and needed really fresh ingredients. So they created some software that helped them to get a really good handle on what they needed and what they were selling. Well, it turned out that that software was so good, such an effective tool, that they later on realized they could sell it more effectively than the baked goods they were making. And they went from being a baked good company to a software company. And that's the kind of thing we want to recognize within our community. What is our secret sauce, I sometimes say, the processes and tools that we have created. If we don't do these things intentionally, if we don't talk about, write down, and revisit the areas that we've got in these three circles, then the result will be a negative culture. And when we have a negative culture, the outcome of our work will either be negated, meaning nothing happens, or negative, meaning it will be damaging. So how do we actually change culture? Well, there are a few ideas. One of them is to value something called reflexiveness, which is simply the practice of going back and reflecting on what you've done and adding in new lessons and constantly improving so that you're layering. What you did last year is built upon this year, and so on and so forth. And keeping those knowledge keepers in prominent positions, giving them jobs such as mentorship or as trainees, or having them, as I said before, write down what they've done so well. It's also important to value the little guy, or the worker bee if you prefer, in organizations. This happens all the time in organizations where I get to do some work. I'm kind of an out there guy. I'm a good talker. And as a result, everybody kind of recognizes me first. But I sometimes feel very bad for the fact that I actually don't do a lot of on-the-ground work compared to most of the people in these initiatives. I'm just the talking head. And so I really feel it's important for us to take real hard time to say thank you to people who do some of the lowest profile work, some of the most important and difficult work, gathering supplies, setting up tables, sweeping the hall afterwards, writing the minutes from your meetings. All of those things are incredibly important. And if you don't give those people praise and thank you, then they leave. And you can often be astonished that you don't know what to do. You don't remember the password for the website, for example, or you don't know the phone number of the person who let you borrow the food truck, that sort of thing. And so it's really, really important that you keep those people not only engaged, but that you let them know how much you appreciate them. Give people a way that they can act. That probably means providing them a menu, and it probably means asking them what they want to do. But if you don't give them a way to actually see that they're achieving something and to personalize it and become invested in it, they'll leave. If you give them something to do that's slacktivist, just kind of giving a meaningless but easy job to them, having them do something that just feels like being kind of a lemming, like for example, standing at a protest and chanting, you're going to not get people to stick around. People actually want to do work. That's been an interesting lesson for me. I used to think that I shouldn't give people too much to do. But what I found out is it's not the amount of work that makes the difference for people, but whether or not they can see evidence that their work is having an impact. And if you can help people to see that their action is making a difference, they will work incredibly hard for you. Next, build inclusive, not exclusive, alliances. Don't only think about increasing your numbers by finding more people like you. In fact, the further that you can reach outside of your circle, the more often you'll actually increase the amount of reach you have. So you might be a social person working in a social service agency, but if you don't engage some things that seem a little bit disparate, like business, the faith community, all different faith communities, government, sports teams, artists, just to name a few, you are missing out. One of the most successful things I've seen happen involved getting people that love dogs to do dog walking as a way of raising money. You can do incredible things by talking to other people and letting them show you how you might have a common interest. Within your group, have conversations. Come to decisions about how you're going to address some common issues. And these are probably not going to be single conversations. You need to have them on a routine basis. How are you going to help people to avoid burnout? Are you going to give them the opportunity for breaks or for moments of repose? Are you going to let them change jobs so they don't get bored and they can try something that's new and challenging? What are you going to have as a philosophy and policy for avoiding conflict? We want people to be challenged. We want people to get feedback. So you have to provide a mechanism or a structure that allows people to have a respectful way of airing their differences. But you also need to be able to recognize and respond quickly when conflict occurs so that you mediate it before it becomes too destructive. And ultimately, if you do have evidence that a conflict is becoming very destructive, and cannot find a way to fix it, sometimes people need to be asked to make the ultimate hard choice to take a break, to leave, or to work in a completely different part of the operation from people that they can't get along with. Constantly measure and report results. I know that data collection doesn't excite some people, but I love doing it because, again, it helps us to show all of our stakeholders that we're making a difference. It helps us to avoid creating decisions or taking on initiatives that are not being productive. So we're not wasting people's time. And going back to that bandwagon effect, if I can go and show people, including government and business, that we're starting to do something impressive and that's making a difference, they will often come aboard. They want, however, in most cases, to see what they call a business case, evidence that people are actually buying in. And don't forget to think about how what you're doing will be sustainable when you're no longer involved. Make it a big tent affair. Keep bringing in people with other talents and people who might one day be able to take on the stuff that you're doing. Teach them your secret sauce. Don't keep it secret. I've really grown tired of people who think that it's about protecting their turf. And a curious thing has happened to me, and I've seen it. And that is, the more that you try to give other people the power to do things, the more that people will respect you. And the opposite is true. The more that you try to kind of define your turf or pretend that you're the only person who knows how to do something, the less people will want to engage or trust you. Finally, make sure that you routinely celebrate success. The success of individuals, the success of your overall initiative, and the success of your team. Celebrate anytime you can, and build that feeling within the culture of your community of practice. One last thing here, and that is the concept of something called legitimate peripheral participation. You might have noticed that some communities are very difficult to crack indeed. Kirsten and I were involved in a project a few years ago where we developed a community training program around mental health, and it was targeted at first responders. And we had some success, but one group of first responders in particular, the police, were really challenging to crack. They did not really want to engage with us, and the frequent thing we heard from them is, we have our own training. And even though we had data that showed the community didn't have a lot of faith in that training, they still didn't want to kind of open up their door to us. So they were a lot like a nut with a very thick shell. Here we were, the newcomers, and here they were, the old-timers, and they wanted to do things a particular way. If we tried to get in there by direct sort of driving in, it was not going to work. So we needed to stop and think about some of the things that are good about being an old-timer, some of the things that are good about being a newcomer, and some of the disadvantages of both cases. When you go out from a practicum, for example, you've probably run into this, where people say, oh, we don't need your college or university thinking, we have a way of doing things. In other words, what they're saying to you is something called, we want you to pick up on our situated learning. Your college learning, your remote learning that's been learned someplace far away is not very valuable to us. Come and see how it's used here. Accept our social practices, and gradually you'll become a full participant inside of the circle. Let me give an example of how this can look and how come it's important to be strategic and to give it time. The case example is actually based on my brother. When he was about 15 years old, my brother got an opportunity to work in a machine shop. He was extremely excited because he was naturally inclined to work with machines, and so was the person who took him on. There was a lot of talk early on about the fact that my brother might eventually become an apprentice and even somebody who could have a share in this shop. But my brother didn't get that opportunity because, in a word, he was highly impatient. He felt he was right here in the middle, in the mature knowledge part of things, that he knew how to do it all. But the owner, the old-timers, thought that he was out here on the very extremity or periphery of the community of practice. And if my brother had had more patience and strategy, he would have made his way through there eventually. He might have taken these 4 steps. Step 1 looks a lot like this. You get to do the stuff that doesn't really have a lot to do with what it is you're there to do. You sweep the floors, you get coffee, you hang around, and you observe. You show people that you're interested, and you show them that in a big basic way, you're trustworthy, that they can stop being wary around you. After a while, they'll invite you into the second circle. Here, you get to do pieces of work, perhaps not the most important things, but nonetheless, it'll be work. And it might have an escalating but smaller part of responsibility. For example, you might have errands or get to contact customers. Then you might get to actually show that you have some of the basic skills, and you'll probably get an opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the values, that you are open to learning more of the shared values of that community. Then, if you do that for a while, you'll get invited into level 3. Here now, you're not just doing one small part of the work, but you might get to do entire projects, or at least to do things that are a series of steps. You'll probably be left alone more and able to lead yourself, making more decisions. And why? So that people can actually watch you and see if you actually are incorporating the values. For example, if my brother got to this level and made a mistake on a piece of equipment or piece of metal, and he decided to kind of cover it up, probably he would have stayed in that area for a long time or even moved here. But if they had seen him fix it and demonstrate that he understood their shared value of focusing on quality, then he might have gradually earned his way into the blue circle. Here he becomes an old timer. He has to take a long time to get there, but when he does, he becomes the teacher, the mentor. He can lead other people. And some of the ideas that he was so eager to bring all the way back here, he can finally bring. So he may in fact end up changing practice. So here's the point. You as a group are all starting off at the same time in this particular exercise. But when you get out there in the real world, chances are you're going to be a newcomer. And you have to be a little strategic, patient, and understand the dynamics of working your way in to the blue dot. So hopefully, although that doesn't matter that much in this particular project, that's valuable to you in the real world.